1865. Two men sit in the parlor of a small farmhouse. Accustomed to facing each other across the distance of a death-strewn battlefield, Union General Ulysses S. Grant and Confederate General Robert E. Lee now meet face to face for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Ink drying, a freshly signed document declares that hostilities between their two mighty armies have now ended. Peace is finally coming to a nation brutally torn by conflict. Short days later, the United States of America reel in shock from the assassination of their president, Abraham Lincoln. From the religious roots of America's Second Great Awakening, and amidst the chaos and bloodshed of the Civil War, a new Christian denomination is born, the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
I think it's not an understatement to say that Adventism was born during very perilous times, particularly in the 1860s when it became a denomination. You had the Civil War.
The problem with the war was not only that it was taking thousands and hundreds of thousands of lives, but that it was distracting attention from the three angels' messages that our Adventist pioneers were trying to preach. They began to feel as though they needed divine help in bringing it to an end, or they might as well just stop preaching.
Recent estimates suggest that maybe 750,000 people died of the Civil War. How do you cope with the loss of all of these people?
The Adventist people, how are they going to interpret this war? Is this the end?
Early Adventism for me is couched in what I would call a diaspora. That makes the movement take the right decisions for it to become a worldwide movement.
It had many of the characteristics of American thought, of individualism and liberty and freedom of conscience and self-determination and trust in God and even respect for country.
The war itself was seen by many in the North, certainly at the popular level, as this crusade to undo a great moral wrong.
They understood that there was something inherently wrong about keeping your brother in slavery and using your brother as a way of profiting from his labor.
And one of the questions that Adventists are going to have to answer is, what is the extent of our support or non-support of the war going to be? And on an individual level, what is your support going to be? Because the question of your loyalty will play into it.
Adventists saw themselves as having a goal, a reason for existence, and that was to evangelize the world. That took a long time to develop, but even from the beginning there was this sense they had to have some organization just to do their mission on earth.
The Civil War era can be best understood as the hinge in American history. We are one way before this hinge swings shut, and we're another way afterwards. Throughout the mid and late 19th century, it describes who we are, our institutions, why even our churches changed or shifted the way they did. From the revivals of the Second Awakening into the fundamentalist movement of the late 19th century. And I think to grasp both our social and religious cultural history, you need to understand how each of those factors reacted to this great shifting in American history.
Across the country, Christians are swept up in the tumult of war and politics. Seventh-day Adventists in particular see the events around them as a reflection of what they call the Great Controversy, a cosmic conflict between good and evil. For them, the biblical war in heaven has also become war on earth, a war for the soul of a nation, a war for the souls of men. The 1830s and 40s, only 60 years since the birth of the nation. It is a time of great expansion and exploration. New states enter the Union, and by the end of the Mexican-American War, vast new territories lie open for discovery and conflict. Both North and South fear that the fight over new territories will shatter the balance of power as they enter the Union as either free or slave states.
Representation in the House of Representatives is based on population, and there the South's going to lose. The South does not have the population that the North does, and as the North continues to grow, the South's power in the House of Representatives is going to shrink. The South's power in the Senate, however, is based on state. If a southern state can be brought into the Union in parallel with any northern states that are brought into the Union, then that balance of power, a roughly even balance of power, can be maintained.
Slavery has been a fact of life in America for almost 2 centuries. In fact, slavery predates the American Revolution and the writing of the words, "all men are created equal," by over 130 years. In the South, slaves work the great fields of tobacco and cotton. The demand for their labor is growing greater and greater.
Slaves began to be seen not so much as persons, but as property, a term we call in America chattel slavery, where the slave's humanity was degraded and the slave himself was dehumanized.
Even as the slave's condition grows worse, the states must perform a delicate dance to maintain the balance of power, a dance whose very steps were written in the Constitution itself and in various compromises over the years, as each generation defers the growing problem of slavery to a later time.
At the same time, and religiously, we have this explosion of revivals.
The Second Great Awakening, as this national religious experience is called, is a widespread American Protestant revival which is at its height during the first 3 decades of the 19th century. It contrasts significantly with the First Great Awakening 100 years earlier.
This time, it's not Calvinistic so much. It's more of an American religion focused on the individual, focused on free choice. It's getting its influence from the Methodists and the Free Will Baptists. Later on, the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists become part of this, who are generally Calvinist by nature, but even they are now picking up this kind of American ethos of the ability to have moral choice.
Many new groups emerge from this spiritual maelstrom, including one which fits firmly into the tradition of the Second Great Awakening, the Adventists. The individuals who begin the Seventh-day Adventist Church do not start as Adventists. They are Baptists and Methodists. They are Presbyterians and Episcopalians. They are Catholics and part of the Christian Connection, and in the 1830s and 40s, many of them are Millerites.
The Millerite movement was a popular religious movement in the United States that surges in what some historians have called the burnt-over district, that is the region between Albany and Buffalo along the Erie Canal. The world was changing in that part of the world because thousands and thousands and thousands of displaced persons were leaving the East Coast, where most Americans had lived in the previous century, and they were going westward. And I think the Millerite movement is a popular response to all that chaos.
William Miller, a New England farmer turned preacher, is a product of the religious democratization during America's Second Great Awakening.
But really, he is a part of the milieu of his time. Methodists, Christian Connection, the Christian churches, Free Will Baptists, the Emerging Disciples of Christ. Many different religious groups of the day were thinking in terms of intense Christian spiritual experience, and were thinking in terms of millennial expectations.
After several years of individual study, Miller begins proclaiming that the prophecies in the Bible's book of Daniel point to the return of Christ around 1843 or 1844. The Millerites, or Adventists as they are sometimes called because they are preaching the imminent second advent of Christ, have their eyes firmly focused on heavenly things in 1844. They have finally settled on the date October 22, when they believe Jesus will come in power to cleanse the earth.
All the Millerites believe that Daniel 8:14, on the 2300 days shall the sanctuary be cleansed. They believe that Jesus would come back and cleanse the world with fire. That, of course, originally was William Miller's interpretation.
But the hopes of the Advent believers are cruelly dashed. October 22, 1844 comes and goes. Jesus has not returned.
It is a cloudy and dark day here. The sheep are scattered, and the Lord has not come yet. Josiah Litch.
Obviously, the Millerites are disappointed, and a great many give up their faith when they realize Jesus isn't returning to earth on their timetable. Those who remain faithful fracture into many small groups with different understandings of what happened that day.
Our fondest hopes and expectations were blasted, and such a spirit of weeping came over us as I have never experienced before. It seemed that the loss of all earthly friends could have been no comparison. We wept and wept till the day dawned. Hiram Edson.
The thought of turning again to the cares, perplexities, and dangers of life, in full view of the jeers and revilings of unbelievers who now scoffed as never before, was a terrible trial of faith and patience. James White.
Some of the remaining believers include Hiram Edson, O.R.L. Crozier, F.B. Hahn, Joseph Bates, a young preacher named James White, and his wife Ellen. These individuals begin publishing their ideas with separate tracts addressing issues such as the true meaning of October 22, 1844, and the Seventh-day Sabbath. Realizing the need to regather and encourage the scattered flock, the separate believers come together, sharing doctrine. In 1849, James White publishes a paper for the group. It is called the Present Truth, but in 1850 becomes the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald.
The Review is a way to begin to keep Sabbatarian Adventists together. At first, it's published just at printers here and there, but then an important step is taken when they move to Rochester, New York. And in 1852, the Review and Herald begins to be published on a Sabbatarian Adventist press in its own office, which is in itself a type of organization. And he stays there until 1855, and then they relocate to Battle Creek, Michigan.
In the 19th century, as settlers moved west, somebody would go ahead, find the property, make arrangements, and then maybe a whole family or even a whole village would come. And this is what happened. There were Bates and a few others went into Michigan, got converts, developed a community, and then the community at Battle Creek invited James White to move.
Well, let's face it, if you were in charge of the publishing house and you had to board all the workers and take care of everything, like they had the conditions that were in Rochester, New York, you'd be happy to get out, because the Whites said that it was like coming out of darkness into light, coming out of captivity into freedom. They finally had a house of their own when they got to Battle Creek. They didn't have to board and keep the rest of the workers.
With the publishing house there, that attracted more and more people. They got more and more converts, and it was the focus of their beginning.
Even as the Sabbatarian Adventists come together, national issues begin forcing prominent Christian denominations apart. In 1844, while the Millerites are convinced the Lord will soon return, the attention of the country at large is captured by other matters. They are fascinated by the sensational June murder of Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. The upcoming presidential election of Polk versus Clay reinvigorates the question of territorial expansion. And in the Methodist and Baptist denominations, national conventions highlight the old concerns over slavery.
One of the first issues that they faced was, can a Christian enslave a fellow Christian? Traditionally, Christians did not enslave their fellow Christians. And so the idea was, when a slave became a Christian, can you then continue to hold him in slavery?
But the Christians are split. See, evangelicals in the South, once slavery has become a profit-driven industry, how far do you go to conflict with that? Do you confront your neighbors and your friends? So there are pastors no longer speaking about this issue as being a sin. The Methodists actually split 3 times. Baptists split several times. Presbyterians split over the issue of slavery. You can or cannot be a voting member of this church and be a slaveholder. Or you must be, so the split was there. So nationally, these churches have already split.
It's sort of the moral discourse has broken down now. And what happens in 1844 sort of almost dictates what happens in 1861. And there can be various political kinds of attempts to prevent it and compromises, but when there's this fundamental moral divide that's taken place, it's going to come to blows sooner or later.
This schism in the churches reflects the nation at large and highlights the great American problem inherent from the very founding of the country. Over the next 15 years, the problem will only grow sharper as the country expands. Unofficially fights over slavery in Bleeding Kansas, has its heartstrings tugged by Uncle Tom's Cabin, and is stunned by John Brown's raid on the U.S. Arsenal at Harper's Ferry. America is a powder keg primed to explode.